Hello everyone and welcome to Arcade Viking. So this is the 12th and final video in my Origins of Modern East Asia series. The subject of this video is the rise of the Japanese Empire, specifically how the Meiji Restoration, the Satsuma Rebellion, the First Sino-Japanese War, and the Russo-Japanese War led to its rise. So, as with the last video, and all the other videos in the series, whenever we hear the names of East Asian countries such as Japan or China or the Koreas or Mongolia, we tend to think of them, and those of us who, all of us who exist in this modern world, we tend to think of them as they exist now in our world, in the modern world, like the map you see here of Japan. However, while it's definitely a valid view, after all, this is how we know these countries and how we've known these countries for decades, for between 80 to 100 years. At this point, it's not the full picture. These countries became the way they were and took on these shapes after a series of events and different processes. So in order to understand how countries like Japan got the way they are and took on the shape that we know them to have in the modern world, we have to go back in time just a little bit to get a better look at the full picture. So that brings us to the Boshin War, which was the subject of the previous video. So the Boshin War was an event when the emperor, alongside an alliance of three very powerful domains, three powerful daimyo clans, the Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa clan, were able to, through the course of a year, defeat pretty handedly and almost completely, with the exception of only a couple of battles, the Tokugawa shogunate and its army, eventually seizing the throne of Japan for itself and enthroning Emperor Meiji as the supreme ruler of Japan, like as you see here. And all of this together, the defeat of the Tokugawa and overthrowment of the Tokugawa shogunate and the enthronement of Emperor Meiji as the supreme ruler of Japan, ushered Japan into an age known as the Meiji period, which also is very well known for what is known as the Meiji Restoration. So, with his ascension to supreme power of Japan, Meiji and his council would create and sign what is known as the Charter Oath, or the Oath in 5 Articles, where it stated that they aim to establish a national wealth on a broad basis, and the framing of a constitution and laws. Deliberative assemblies shall be established and widely used, and decided by open discussion. All classes, high and low, shall be united in vigorously carrying out the administration of affairs of state. The common people, no less than the civil and military officials, shall be allowed to pursue their own calling so that they may not be in discontent. Customs of the past shall be broken off, and everything based on just laws of nature. And knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundation of Japan and its imperial rule. This also was shortly followed by the abolition of the Han system. So the Han system was the system of provinces that existed during the Tokugawa shogunate, where daimyo were sequestered, provincial lords, governors, originally warlords and feudal lords, were sequestered to their own specific domains, whether they be Satsuma or Choshu or Tosa, or say Echigo over here, Echigo over here, and things like that. And they would be what would be now considered, as you just saw, a thing of the past, a tradition of the past, would be abolished and will be replaced by the creation of prefectures. which were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 prefectures were created, and they often could consist of several different provinces. So with the creation of the Charter of Five and the abolishment of the Han system and the creation of prefectures, now we need to look at the government of this of this new empire. So obviously, the supreme authority of this new dynasty, of this new Japanese empire, the Meiji Empire, was the emperor. And below him, you had things like the Diet, which would consisted of the House of Peers and Representatives, the electorate, the Prime Minister, etc., all the way down. And they still kept the elder statesmen, Privy Council, and things like that. And with all of this in mind, the daimyo would be the title of daimyo would be also abolished and would be replaced by the title of kazoku, or magnificent exalted lineage. And these would be generally the bureaucrats and politicians, the higher ranking members of Imperial Japanese society. And among these new kazoku, these bureaucrats, stood 3 individuals above all. These individuals would become known as the 3 great nobles, and they were the sort of general de facto leaders of the Sacho Alliance imperial forces during the Boshin War. These were Saigo Takamori, Okubo Toshimichi of Satsuma, and Kasara Kogoro, who had now at this point changed his name to Kido Takeyoshi of Choshu. Though, to be fair, I would argue that Takotsuki Shinasuke and Sakamoto Ryoma should also be considered 2 additional members to these great nobles, because even though they did not live to see the fruits of their labors, this alliance between these 3 individuals and these the 3 domains, Tosa, Choshu, and Satsuma, would not have happened without Sakamoto Ryoma, and the ability of the the ability of the Japanese Imperial Army to defeat the shogunate forces would not have happened without Takasugi. But with that preference aside, that's not the case. The general consensus is that the 3 great nobles are the individuals that you see here, even though I still think that the other 2 should be included. And eventually, much later in the Meiji era, various members of the Kazoku and lower-ranking bureaucrats would create the Meiji Constitution and would present it to Emperor Meiji, essentially creating a constitutional monarchy of sorts, but not quite. It had sort of the same idea, but it's still, unlike a constitutional monarchy in, like, say, Britain, where the queen or king is a figurehead, the emperor still held the absolute power. But it still also outlined various procedures and ways to keep the government stable and to help the lower classes of Japanese society. So with all of that in mind, we now need to look at how foreign relations between Japan and foreign powers looked in the Meiji era. So first of all, the Imperial Japanese government ended permanently the idea of Japanese isolation and allowed foreign visitors to visit Japan. Of course, under some stipulations, but they definitely allowed foreign visitors to visit Japan. In fact, these are U.S. tourists here visiting Japan. They would also send educational missions and diplomatic missions to various different foreign powers, such as the Iwakura mission, which went to the U.S. and Europe. I forgot to add Europe into that, but it went to both Europe and the U.S. And it was a mission of both diplomacy and also to provide Japanese individuals, both male and female, as you see here, with foreign educations with hopes of strengthening Japan as a whole. Also, a good example of foreign relations during this point in time was the Sekanron debate that was started by Saigo Takamori. So Saigo Takamori, unlike Okubo Toshimichi and Katsura Kagero, Kido Takeori, unlike his fellow members of the great nobles, Saigo Takamori was not a big fan of the modernization of Japan to a point. He understood the importance of its modernization, but what he didn't like was that the samurai class, was gradually becoming more and more obsolete. So eventually, in 1873 CE, he, in the council, along with Emperor Meiji and the various other Kazoku bureaucrats, he began to heavily suggest and argue for him, Saigo Takamori, going to Korea and insulting the Korean emperor and the Korean ruling council so much with the hopes that he would be executed by the Korean royalty. And once that happened, his idea was that they would use his execution as a pretext to invade Korea. Needless to say, none of the council agreed, including his fellow great nobles. They all essentially thought that this was going a step too far, and he was essentially let out to pasture and was like, maybe you should retire. Like, I can only imagine how this conversation went. Yeah, I want to go to Korea, and I want to piss off all of the Korean government so that they'll kill me, and then that way you can go and invade them. And then Akubo and Katsura going like, Saigo, are you okay? Like, because that's not normal. Are you okay, Saigo? You know, I can only imagine how that went. Of course, we'll never really know because we weren't privy to that thing. But as I said, none of the council agreed, and he would be essentially heavily suggested to go into retirement. All right, so now it is time to look at Japanese society during this new era. So first of all, the Meiji era and the Meiji Restoration saw the implementation of what is known as the Bunmei Taika, or civilization and enlightenment. And it was the idea of copying Western, particularly American and British, styles of clothing, carriages. They would import and copy the American and European horse carriage designs, cannon designs. They would also construct hybrid Western and Japanese buildings in the hopes of catching up to and emulating Western powers. They would copy Western fashion senses. Japanese men and women and children would wear Western style clothing, mainly in urban areas, not necessarily in rural areas. Rural areas were a little bit farther away from this idea, but urban areas, people who lived in urban areas especially did this. It would also see the establishment of a Western style, American, European, Euro-American style post office service. It would see the change in food practices, where the consumption of meat, especially beef, pork, and chicken, would increase exponentially, because originally in Japan, with the exception of seafood and maybe occasionally chicken and things like that, the Japanese diet was heavily and predominantly vegetarian. And this was due to the belief in the sanctity of life, and predominantly Buddhism, but also Shintoism as well, the two main religions of Japan at the time, during the Sengoku and Tokugawa era. But with these Western ideas flowing in, popular dishes that included meat, such as types of ramen like tonkotsu ramen and things like that, would grow in popularity. This era would also see the implementation of several reforms to benefit the Japanese society, also to sort of make Japanese society more centralized and more economically fluid, such as the land tax reform, which saw a shift in how taxes were calculated. Originally, in the Tokugawa era, taxes were calculated based off of crop yield. Now they would be based off of cash yield, and it would promote a cash-based system over payment with crops. Set the tax rate at 3%, which was a reduction from the previous system. Landowners were now legal, and it was confirmed by the issuance of land bonds, but the landowners were liable for taxes instead of the farmer, which farmers who had been, say, tenant farmers definitely benefited from. And the system was standardized across all of Japan. But it could end up being a burden on villages with hunter-gatherer lifestyles, with uncultivated lands, and resulted in several insurrections against the Meiji government, such as the Ise Revolt and the Makaba Revolt, that were very quickly put down. The discontent also helped fuel the Freedom for People's Right movement. So eventually, the Meiji government lowered the tax rate to 2.5% in 1877 to sort of maybe prevent further revolts. But the biggest benefit, going back all the way to the landowner point, private land ownership was recognized for the first time in Japan with the issuance of land titles. The previous practice of land ownership was the public land, public citizen laws, which stated that all land was under the sole ownership of the emperor, such that individual farmers were merely borrowing from the land from feudal lords, who in turn were borrowing it from the emperor, which was based off of the Chinese style, of land ownership, which I talked about in the Northern and Southern Kingdoms video of China. And this reform abolished the archaic system of land ownership and began to allow landowners to use their property as financial assets and collateral or other investments. The previous feudal system became obsolete because the landowner was the one held responsible for taxes, and it gave landowners the right to participate in politics. Later, when the imperial diet was established, many of those given the right to vote in the lower house belonged to the landowning class. And in the previous system, rice and crops collected from each fiefdom were sold and distributed by wholesale dealers via daimyo storehouses in Edo or Osaka. The reform allowed farmers to sell their own crops to local merchants and had a large effect on Japanese commerce. Yeah. This leads us to women in the Meiji era. Now, this is a rather long section, and I won't read every single point. You can pause to read each point. But generally, women in the Meiji era initially did not have rights. They were subject to the will of household heads because of the patriarchal lineage of succession. Daughters were often only married via arranged marriage. The disobedience of a male head could result in expulsion. Men were allowed to, for the most part, murder their spouses if they, I don't want to say dishonored, because the idea of dishonor is a little overused, but if they insulted them in any way, if they had extramarital affairs, etc., and things like that. Though eventually, to combat these, divorce laws were generally limited to things like sterility, adultery, and disobedience to parents-in-law, larceny, jealousy, disease, and to combat the aforementioned abuse and potential killing by the husbands, cruelty was added to it as well to protect women involved. Women were also, though women were considered incompetent of raising children, they were the ones who were sort of put in charge of raising children, much like they had been in the Tokugawa era and much like women were in China. And so with that idea, very similar to Qing Dynasty China, women were given an education with the raising of children in mind, and women did eventually get to participate in the modern education campaign of Japan, going to schools, though sometimes women were pulled out of schools for a variety of different reasons. Uh, um, the Japanese government did eventually in 1872 state that any remaining practices of female exclusion on shrine and temple grounds and in schools and things like that uh, shall be end, and they shall be permitted to participate in these things like that. Also, graduation was not assured, as often again women would be pulled from schools to marry or to study practical matters, quote unquote. There was also a need for massive amounts of labor to help with the modernization of Japan. So oftentimes, families would sell their daughters to factories and other things like that, other industries, which led to an increase and a proliferation of women workers. Eventually, by 1913, there were about 800,000 workers, and these helped grow the silk and cotton industries. Also, the growing of silk and cotton industries helped grow the demand for more women, so it was sort of a endless loop. Some women were better off than others. They would be given advance fees. The girls' families would be given advance fees. The fee would be seen as additional income, which would enable them to pay off their rent and things like that. Wages for women, again, some women were better off. Wages for superior workers and, like, say, the silk factory were about 9.2 yens per year, and would eventually, in 1880, rise to 17.69 yens. However, many women were not paid minimum wage. They were paid irregularly also. And some women were only paid in lower factories were only paid about 4.5 yen a year, with men being paid only about 6.8 yen a year. And these working conditions were very similar to working conditions in factories in the U.S. and Britain, were not very favorable. Women worked long shifts that could last to over 12 hours, sometimes 14 hours. They were heavily supervised by a grading system. They were often lived in cramped quarters. They were not allowed sick leave or anything like that. Also, tuberculosis was a serious problem. So was cholera, which wreaked havoc in these areas. And also, they had another disease known as beriberi, which was a symptom of poor diet because they obviously had a poor diet. And if women attempted to run away from these factories, they would oftentimes be quickly caught by a team of men sent out to catch them. Some committed suicide to get out of this oppressive system. Yet, most women, despite all these things I mentioned, preferred the factory over the farm because farm labor could be more demanding than factory work, and things like that. And because most of these girls were uneducated and provincial in their outlook, they would sometimes be given by the 1900s they were started to being offered primary education by these factories. So that was another reason women would go to these areas to get an education. With all of that in mind, with the lack of rights held by women during this period of time, there would, again, very similar to the U.S. and Britain, Japan would see a rise in women's rights movements as women began to organize themselves into unions as a result of their exposure to U.S. labor unions, especially after the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 CE. However, of course, they faced very similar to the U.S. and Britain, faced stiff opposition from companies. These movements were seen as roadblocks and things like that, and they the government was bent on only listening to these companies. It was also difficult for leaders to maintain these movements, as factory workers would threaten, factory owners would threaten the workers. Um, but given all these factors, it is imperative to note how oppressive the conditions could have been, such that a huge number of self-proclaimed and societally enforced docile and obedient women had to defy authorities to go on strikes. The claim of benevolent paternalism by employers was obviously a complete farce and lie. So this led to this was in conjunction with the development of public spaces such as schools and magazines that favored the appearance of in public of various models for women. Some found employment there at teaching girls in these schools, and so they sought change so they could access more of these. And so many of these women became public figures to work for what they considered to be the public good, and they started forming what are known as Fujin Kai, or women's groups, many of which were founded in the second half of the 1880s, with the foremost goal being educating their members with new theories of women education and roles. Girls who managed to graduate from schools formed the groups in order to continue learning and meeting with friends. And some were small, but they were publicized heavily by newspapers that did not criticize their existence. And the fact that that happened shows that they were in line with the enlightened progressive policy supported by the Meiji Restoration. Crucial reason for the existence of such spaces was that women of learning worked together. Members of the Fukaku Women's Association met once a month and argued for this change of society. And by meeting periodically and by listening to public speeches that directly concerned women, such as education, hygiene, and household economy, and by discussing these things together, they wanted to pursue the woman's way. And it's not surprising that because of this, it's not surprising many of these groups work together. Others, such as the Women's Lecture Group, met in an elementary school and was founded by both men and women to improve female education. It was attended by like 100 women. One of the speakers was Kimura Sadako. The latter group, one of the largest. Kimura Sadako, who belonged to the Tokyo Fujin or Fujin Kyoku Donawaki, apologies for possibly butchering that, or the Tokyo Women's Educational Conversation Society, which was one of the largest at this period in time, one of the largest groups working at this period in time. And though in December it would be named the Great Japan's Women Education Society, and women founded the group because the world's knowledge expands daily and men are allowed to pursue the studies and progress together with it, whereas women have been kept ignorant, so i.e. women were not allowed to get an education. And they believed that this development would benefit their homes and also their nation. The women asked for more education and the possibility of becoming active participants in their society, which was not allowed at that point in time. And they began to realize that working and campaigning together would enhance the spreading of their measures and attaining their goals. See here, what is it? And they would support they claimed that women had to reform the customs and laws based on the revere men, despise women idea. And they would support the formation of monogamous families because men were still allowed to have extramarital affairs while women were not. They would abolish prostitution, reform the family, and the family system and social relations, and would oppose the consumption of alcohol and tobacco and dissipation and indolence. However, these were very difficult and far-reaching goals to accomplish. And the fact that these movements began to take traction is in part because men were not excluded and were often invited to become honorary members. Male presence in women's groups was not always welcomed, but um, because we're not always welcome because women did made this group to free themselves of male oppression. But it's also important to note that many were also formed based on men's advice, um, uh, and many of the regulations were written by men. And it's also important to note that only groups that were both male and female were able to blend nationalistic goals with the aspiration, with their own aspirations to flourish and to legitimate their existence, as well as to attempt to succeed with their social advancement. Without supporters such as Iwamoto Yoshihiro, women could not have actually would have had much more difficulties. I don't want to say couldn't have done it, but they would have had much more difficulties in this, in the very patriarchal, and men-centric society of Japan at the time. And so, with all of this going on, women in these groups began to take control of their own agendas and funds to build their own networks. These were activities that a small number of men could carry out from within their political associations and parties that exclude women. Again, going back to, there are some things that these groups could not do without the help of men. But regardless of whether or not women considered this a sufficient substitute, through the participation in Fujinkai, women were learning to become active citizens. So, with all of that aside, the Fujinkai were still incredibly useful and incredibly powerful methods of women gaining rights in Meiji Japan. And so here you are, and this is women working in these various factories, which again could be very hazardous, but also very profitable to some women, but also had very varying methods of payment. And here are several women in one of those Fujinkai women's groups here. Now, with the social aspect out of the way, we're going to take a look at the art and entertainment of the Meiji era. So, the Meiji era, much like the Tokugawa shogunate before it, and even the Sengoku Jidai, the Sengoku period, saw a flourishing of large numbers of very beautiful art, such as this painting here, known as the Byobu Dragon and Tiger. This is only half of it. You'll see the other half in a second. That was painted sometime in 1895 CE. Here is the other half with the dragon on it. Again, very beautiful painting. You saw the production of beautiful pieces of metalworking, vases and ceramics with enamelware in here, depicting things like such as wildlife scenes. Saw the carving of iron figurines, again going back to metalworking, such as this metal falcon or hawk. You saw the production of beautiful textile art, such as this piece of fabric here, porcelain, beautifully designed porcelain bowls, and well carved and beautifully carved lacquerware. I know I keep saying beautiful a lot, but that's essentially the best way to describe it. This period also saw the rise in what is known as Shingeki style theater, which, unlike the Kabuki style, focused more on realism, that you can see here. And it was much more based off of the realism movement that was going on in much of the West during this period of time. You also begin to see the rise in popularity of both Western music and hybrid styles of music combining Western and Japanese elements, like you see here. So you would see, say, maybe Japanese singing and Japanese style flutes with Western instruments like cellos and things like that, or just simply Western style music. You also begin to see the production of one, I forgot to mention to add it here, but also you begin to see the translation of Western textbooks and books and literature, as well as the production of Japanese, native Japanese literature. But you also begin to see the production of journals and pamphlets by the Japanese Empire, such as the Meryoku Zasashi, apologies for butchering that, or the Journal of Japanese Enlightenment that you see here. The Meiji era also focused heavily on education reform. In fact, education stood out among all other subjects and reforms, and was heavily prioritized by ministries by ministries in the Japanese government. Starting from elementary schools, the reform aimed at popularizing basic education for the general public. In 1870, the Meiji government put into action the new law regulations on elementary, secondary schools, and universities, following which the Ministry of Education was established. A more radical law, the Institution of Schools, was published into power in 1872, which abandoned the existing privately owned and traditional styled schools across Japan and banned the opening of more of such kind, only allowing for modern Western styled schools in the country. Starting in the 1880s, Japan began implementing the policy of obligatory education for 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years subsequently, while pushing finally for a 6-year mandatory education for all citizens. In late period Meiji Restoration, the government already achieved a nationwide mandatory basic education and refocused on reforming higher education and developing modern science and technologies. During the Meiji Restoration, the government helped elementary and secondary schools to helped to open 60. Helped elementary and secondary schools to open 60 technical programs and incorporated technical subjects into the higher education system. By founding a complete system on technical education, the Meiji government succeeded in disseminating the Western science and technologies into the general public and the next generation of the labor force, resulting in a large group of high-quality professionals and technologies who had made great contributions to Japan's economy and industrial success, in stark contrast to what was going on in China at the time, which had only partially achieved their reforms to modernize. So here's some of the here's the Department of Education, and here's one of the Western-style schools that you see here. Japan would also hire several dozens of foreign specialists, such as Edward S. Morse and William S. Clark, as advisors in Japanese modernization, where they would help both discover certain natural resources to industrialize on, and would help build new industries. These specialists would come from the U.S., Britain, France, Germany, etc., etc., and they would pay them very heavily. They would pay them the best salaries they could have to help Japan accomplish this. Again, in stark contrast to China, which hired basically anyone, whether they were specialists or not, which hindered their modernization rather than helped it. So now, with that in mind, we need to look at religion in the Meiji era. So in the Meiji era, the imperial court, the Japanese Empire, decided to place their patronage over state Shintoism instead of Buddhism. And here's a picture of state Shintoism. And I'll explain this picture in a second. So they believed that rather than accepting, rather than using foreign modes of religion like Buddhism and also foreign methods of philosophy like, say, Neo-Confucianism, Japan needed to use native methods and religions such as Shintoism, which is slightly different than how they were doing, where like, oh, old methods like the Han system and such needed to be abolished. But this is what they did. And because of this patronage and this sort of moving away from Buddhism, two different things happened. The Shimbutsu Bunri, or the separation of Shinto and Buddhist temples, and the Haibutsu Kishaku, or the abolish Buddhism and destroy Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni, which led to Buddhist temples being raided and stormed all over Japan, and resulted in the destruction of various Buddhist temples and artifacts, such as Buddhist bells, which are being destroyed here to be smelted down for manufacturing methods, as well as the burning of, and this again, I told you I had to explain that picture, the burning of thousands of Buddhist texts, and the defacement and vandalization of thousands of Buddhist, I don't want to say monasteries, Buddhist altars and pagodas and temples too. Now, Buddhism still is a major religion in Japan, and Buddhism still held some authority in the Meiji era, but this was definitely a dark time for it. Also, in very stark contrast to the Tokugawa shogunate, which brutally persecuted Christians and Christianity and outlawed Christianity, the Meiji era, Meiji Japan, would legalize Christianity and would end the persecution of Christians, which led to the construction of thousands of Christian temples, Christian churches, Catholic churches, and things like that, all throughout Japan. Of course, Shintoism and Buddhism are still the majority religions in Japan, with Shintoism being the bigger of the two, but Christianity does definitely exist in large numbers in Japan as well. All right, now it is time to look at the industrialization of Japan in the Meiji era. So the Meiji government began pushing for a policy that heavily encouraged the construction of mines and railways, as well as other things like telegraph lines, with mines being one of the most strategic industries for the Meiji government, with 30% of the Meiji investment being made by the Ministry of Industries going into mines. Japan built railway networks with the idea of one, building up on infrastructure, but also allowing for the transportation of the materials from mines, allowing for both mining, mining and the railway system to play a critical role in Japan's industrialization. With again, railways mainly transporting during this time period major goods such as energy resources such as coal, charcoal, and crude minerals such as ore and lime, food such as rice, tea and salt, and industrial goods such as steel, paper, and cement. And here's one of the railways here, and here is one of the mines. And as you can see, with the rise of this industry, you begin to see a decrease in native industries starting in the 1880s and eventually increasing exponentially by 1935 to 1940, but really even by 1915 and 1910 and 1905, meaning that modern industries like mining and manufacturing took over, which in itself led to an overall growth of Japan's GDP, so that generally by so there were several enterprise booms. There was the overall, and then you had the mid Meiji, which had the highest nominal, and et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that based off of this graph, that industry grew very quickly, and so did the economy. And it also grew generally in conjunction with a population increases, with the highest being in the late Meiji and the second enterprise boom here. We also begin to see the rise in so I say the rise in agriculture here. Of course, agriculture existed with rice farming and things like that, but you begin to see the rise of commercial agriculture during the Meiji era, with seeing the establishment of the Department of Agriculture and Commerce in Tokyo. There we go. And beginning to see the exponential rise in export of agricultural products such as rice and barley and potatoes and things like that. Though it's also important to note that there was, in this rush to industrialize and modernize, there would be a great deal, probably very unsurprisingly, of environmental destruction in the Meiji era. So, for one thing, many of the mining industries would, very much like they still do today, would poison many water supplies and food supplies. So, for example, a massive tree blight would occur here, massive fish kill off occurs here, 1,600 hectares of water would be contaminated by copper poison here, and these would all coincide with things like the discovery of the Takanosu lode, the Yakomobu large lode, etc., etc. So, of course, as mining industry grew and as new mines were opened, these environmental disasters would begin to increase. This would also be the time period that the Japanese here and the Hokkaido wolf here would go extinct. And that's because, whereas originally wolves were seen as natural spirits in Shintoism and, say, the possible reincarnations of ancestors and by Buddhism, they were now seen as pests who would just come and kill livestock, because livestock was part of that commercial agriculture increase. So in response to the quote-unquote threat to livestock, the Meiji government would order a massive state-run extermination campaign of both the Japanese wolf and the Hokkaido wolf, with Japanese and Ainu, who were traditional hunters, and I'll talk about them in a minute, also taking part, though Ainu to a lesser degree than the traditional Japanese. Of course, the most well-known product of the Meiji Restoration was the Japanese military modernization, because Japan took a series of solutions, such as purchasing directly weapons and weaponry from Western countries, paying high salaries in order to attract technical talents from the West, which we already talked about, as well as implementing advanced technologies and applying modern 48 management methods to overhaul and expand the old military factories and mines owned previously by daimyo feudal lords of the shogunate era. The new government of Meiji started a handful of modern arsenals, such as the Sekiguchi arsenal and the Yokosuka arsenal, which had originally been passed on from the shogunate period, and they transferred them into the Tokyo arsenal and the Yokosuka naval factory in 1860 CE. And then, 1869 CE, and then in 1870 CE, the government took over the Nagasaki arsenal and converted it into just simply the naval arsenal. These modern arsenals produced massive numbers of firearms and naval ships. With the increasing demand of modern equipment by armies and navies, the military factories started to make Japan independent from Western weaponries and armories. The arsenals not only brought in the latest technologies from the West, but also invested in original research and development to foster local innovations and technological advancement. Again, in stark contrast to the attempt at modernization in China, which only did this partially. So, to tackle issues in the Japanese army that had been present since the Boshin War were imported guns of various different models and diverse origins. Again, remember the Enfield, the Manet, and the Spencer repeating rifle and things like that all coexisted. The Japanese army and the Japanese arsenals would begin to develop their own rifles in 1880, which had a range of around 2.5 kilometers, which was widely used in the First Sino-Japanese War, i.e. they began to standardize the weaponry used by the Japanese military rather than relying on a variety of different weapons. Similarly, the naval arsenal was able to use self-made steel to produce their own cannons. So thus, with that, that with the advancement on military industries, the Japanese military forces received a large-scale upgrade in terms of equipment, which, despite what I said earlier, China had too, but to a much lesser degree. And so here are these arsenals and armories and naval bases and naval factories. And this is the rifle in question that the Japanese military began to, the imperial military began to manufacture as the standard weapon for the Japanese army. And that is the Meiji Murata 22nd model magazine rifle, which was based off of, if you can't tell, off of sort of off of the Enfield, the Theresa, which was also breech loading, and the Mine rifles. This is the early model, and this is the later model. And here are the battleships that the Japanese fleet implemented. They, rather than using the old, now at this point by the 1880s and 1890s, outdated ironclads, which when they originally got them were state-of-the-art, they now moved on to the new upgrade in battleships, which were the destroyers, which were used up until the end of World War II. And you can see those here. And here is the general makeup of the Japanese Imperial Army. As you can see, they had Western style uniforms that they used, and they used, rather than things like katana, Japanese traditional swords, they used European style sabers and European style weaponry. And there's even a bayonet here. And then here's some more of the Japanese army here. And here is a lieutenant here. Now that I've mentioned the katana, it's time to move on to three of the reforms that I think had some of the biggest impacts. I know had some of the biggest impacts on the Meiji era. Not as big as, say, the industrialization or the military reforms, but still pretty close. And in this case, these reforms are also sort of connected to the military reforms. So first off, the samurai class was abolished and was transformed into the shizoku, or the warrior family class, which was in between the bureaucrat class that was the kazoku, that was a combination of the daimyo classes and the kuge council classes, and the shizoku was in between that and the heimin, or the commoners, who generally stayed the same, but this meant the shizoku had no special class privilege and only had this title so it could be on the register. After that, the Haito Edict, the Haito-rei, or the sword ban, was implemented, which took away the privileges of the samurai class. It also prohibited farmers and merchants and basically everyone who wasn't in the military or part of special police to wield swords. And it was specifically a measure to restore public safety, especially during the transition period between the Boshin War and the Meiji Restoration. Following that, a much less strict edict was passed, the Danpatsure Edict, which was only encouraged, not required, but it allowed samurai to cut their top knots and wear their hair in the Western manner, which was generally looked down upon during the Tokugawa period and also during the Sengoku Jidai. Also, samurai lost their monopoly on the military service, as universal military conscription was instituted in the same year. Was instituted 2 years after the Danpatsure Edict, which allowed for basically, and actually required everyone in Japan, regardless of class, to enlist into the Japanese military, thus again ending samurai monopoly on military service. Also, samurai lost their hereditary stipends that had been provided by the daimyo during the Tokugawa shogunate, with those being abolished in the same year that the universal conscription was instituted. These measures, especially the swords, the prohibition of wearing swords, was highly controversial in the Meiji oligarchy. However, eventually, the argument that these were an outdated tradition won the day. Essentially, they were argued that these were an anachronism, and so it was decided to, regardless of the whatever reservations members of the Meiji oligarchy, who themselves were also former samurai, had, that it was time to leave behind the samurai and the carrying of swords by samurai and to move on into the modern era. And so in 1876, the Haito Edict, which again was connected to the Haito Rei, was passed by the Daijo Kan, by one of the ruling councils, and it prevented former samurai from carrying swords, much like the Haito Rei did for all classes. And here is the traditional Japanese sword, katana, and here are like what top knots look like. Sometimes they could just be like what I've got, a ponytail. Sometimes people had a shaved head and the ponytail was bring on top. There were various different variations. However, in response to these edicts, the Haito Edict, the Haito Rei, which is again essentially the same thing as the Haito Edict, and the Danpatsu Rei Edict, several samurai rebellions broke out. Samurai rebellions that failed, for that matter. These included the Sago Rebellion and the Aikizuki Rebellion, which broke out around the same time. The Sago Rebellion in 1874, the Akizuki Rebellion in 1876. As well as in the same year as the Akizuki Rebellion, the Hagi Rebellion, and October 28th through November 5th of 1876, with the Akizuchi Rebellion going from October 17th to November 24th, 1876. And all three of these rebellions were pretty quickly, as you can see, within only a few months, were put down. They were quelled and put down fairly handily. There was also the Shinpurin Rebellion, also in the same year as the Hagi and Akazuki rebellions, which again was pretty quickly put down. Actually, it was put down in a day, as you can see here. And so once, so even though those rebellions were put down, that would not be the end of them, because for one thing, the Satsuma domain would establish several Shigaku military academies, allowing for Satsuma to become a haven of former samurai. So upon hearing about this, and upon hearing about the stockpiling of weapons, the imperial military was sent by the imperial government to remove the weapons from these arsenals, which led to a clash at Kagoshima near Satsuma in this attempt to remove these weapons in February of 1877 CE. So in response to this, Saigo Takamori would take up the sword again and would gather his forces in Satsuma and would begin the Satsuma Rebellion, which lasted almost a year. Lasted from January 29th to September 24th, 1877 CE. And here is Saigo Takamori here. Now, it should be important to note that they did not rely only on, they were still a modern army. A movie based off of this rebellion called The Last Samurai was put out back in the early thousands, but it had, instead of Saigo Takamori and his army dressing in modern uniforms like they did, it had them dressing in traditional samurai garb, which, to be fair, some people, as you can see, some members of the rebellion did, but generally it was a modern army versus a modern army rather than a samurai army versus a modern army. However, despite Saigo Takamori beginning this rebellion, he would pretty quickly face several defeats, such as the Satsuma defeat at the siege of Kumamoto Castle from February to April of 1877 CE. Also, there would be an imperial victory before that, during that time, at the Battle of Tabarazuka. And so the defeat at Kumamoto Castle and the defeat at the Battle of Tabarozuka would lead Saigo Takamori and his Satsuma forces to retreat from Kumamoto, and they would begin to implement guerrilla warfare against the imperial forces for several months, from about April 12th to September 24th, 1877 CE. Of course, this would eventually end in failure, as on September 24th, 1877 CE, the Imperial Army would finally hunt down Saigo Takamori's Satsuma forces and would defeat them at the Battle of Shiroyama, which was, at this point in time, Saigo Takamori's forces were only about 500 strong. They did have modern weapons, and they did use modern rifles. Again, some of them did dress in traditional samurai garb, but as you can see over here, a lot of them also did dress in uniforms, modern uniforms. And eventually, the forces of Saigo Takamori's Satsuma army, that was only about 500 strong again, began to be whittled down, and eventually Saigo Takamori and his remaining soldiers would lead a desperate final charge, essentially a suicidal charge, against Imperial forces, where they would be gunned down by the Imperial rifles and a couple of Gatling guns. And it would eventually end in Saigo Takamori committing seppuku, or ritual suicide. So, with that out of the way, we now need to talk about what is essentially a massive elephant in the room that is the Meiji Restoration. The Japanese expansion into Hokkaido and the cultural genocide and forced assimilation of the Ainu, which started in 1869 CE and continues in many ways still into the present, even though the Ainu have gained rights to practice their culture. So, Hokkaido is the northernmost island in the Japanese archipelago, that you see here. But traditionally, it was not always part of Japan. Japan was generally only these three islands you see here. Hokkaido, as well as the island of Sakhalin, part of what is now modern-day Eastern Russia, the southernmost tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula, as well as the various islands you see here, were the traditional homeland of the indigenous Ainu people. But after the victory of the Boshin War and the defeat of the Ezo Republic, which was based in Hokkaido, the Japanese Empire began to expand into Hokkaido and annexed Hokkaido into their empire, which of course brought them into conflict with the Ainu. Now, there was no military conflicts. The military conflicts between the Ainu and the Japanese happened during the Tokugawa shogunate and ended in disaster both times. So the Ainu had sort of stopped, and they were at this point highly decentralized, but it still did bring quite a lot of conflict, social conflict, and discrimination of the Ainu at the hands of the Japanese. In fact, you can see in this picture these Japanese soldiers obviously snickering and making fun of the Ainu and their cultural practices. And as you can see here, as I said, at this point in time, Japan had already begun moving into Hokkaido during the Tokugawa era and had already defeated the Ainu in several large-scale revolts and wars, such as Shakushin's revolt, which I mentioned in the Tokugawa shogunate video, and also a couple of other smaller revolts. And the Ainu were, rather than being agriculturalists like the Japanese, they were predominantly hunter-gatherers. They were very skilled very skilled hunters and very skilled fishermen. They also were very skilled whalers. They would go on whaling expeditions like you see here. But eventually, the Japanese Empire would begin the forced assimilation of the Ainu. So they renamed the island of Ezo Hokkaido, and they would consider it terra nullius by the Hokkaido Land Regulation in 1872, and in 1872 redistributed the land amongst the Japanese settlers. and the Japanese Empire viewed the annexation of Hokkaido, originally Ezo, as a way to provide a buffer zone against Western powers such as the Russian Empire, which, as I mentioned earlier, as I mentioned in the Boshin War video, and the Tokugawa Shogunate video, had already begun to expand into Asia. Also, Hokkaido offered numerous possibilities to exploit natural resources such as coal and gold and silver and things like that. And it provided a way for the ex-bushi class to profit off of these resources, as they now had to find a new place and a new trade in Japanese society. So, with this in mind, it was deemed important to assimilate the Ainu as quickly as possible, leading to the establishment of Ainu assimilation policies, which began in 1871, and they were officially integrating, at least on paper, the Ainu into the common people, the Heimin, the commoner class. And they were officially integrated into this class by the family registration law. But in spite of it, they were not considered equal to Japanese, and their official designation was Kyoto-jin, which means foreign aborigine. And it was created, this denomination was created as a way to constantly remind the Ainu of their past and their quote-unquote inferior status. And they are defined by what they were, but are no longer allowed to be what they were, but and they must become Japanese citizens. As a final touch to this legal assimilation, Ainu were also forced into the Military Conscription Act in 1898. As part of Japan's first modern population census in 1872, the Ainu population census also takes place at this time. Administrators are sent to Hokkaido to carry it out and begin giving out, and forcibly giving out, for that matter, Japanese surnames to the Ainu. And they're randomly given these names according to contemporary sources, sometimes ending with a whole village being given the same name, regardless of family ties. Family ties are, of course, very important to Ainu, so this was a heavy blow to the Ainu. Up until that point, their lineage had been civilized by the passing down of sacred symbols, such as arrowheads or catch made during hunting parties, men's ceremonial dress. Women often wore bosom girdles underneath their clothing, whose design was passed down by the mother, and must be kept secret from Ainu men as a way to prevent misfortune from the family. Both of these things were used in safe conducts, believed to be used as safe conducts by the deceased to be rejoined with their ancestors in the land of the dead. But these were rendered useless by the random attribution of surnames to the Ainu. In parallel, the Hokkaido Development Agency, officially charged with governing Hokkaido, changed most of Hokkaido's toponyms from the Ainu language to Japanese language, i.e. they changed a lot of the place names to Japanese, further dispossessing the Ainu. And also the Ainu were banned from certain traditions that highlighted their identity as a separate ethnic group, such as the practice of Chisei Gomori, or the ritual burning of a deceased person's house. The Ainu language, Chisei in the Ainu language, is outlawed. The Ainu believed that after death, the deceased person became a ghost who would haunt its home during its transhumance between the human world and the spirit world, bringing misfortune onto the village. Hence, the house had to be burned. In this case, the banning of the practice gave birth to a new one, showing that the Ainu were also capable of adaptation, according to which the person would be removed from the house by a hole in the wall so as not to find the door, and would be carried out to the graveyard meandering around the village so as not to remember the way from the grave to the house. Furthermore, all of the deceased person's possessions were to be broken and the house rearranged so the ghost would not be able to recognize their house. The Japanese, the Hokkaido Development Agency, the Japanese Empire, would also eradicate, would ban the tradition of male earrings and women ritual tattoos, which served as a visible reminder of a separate culture and one that must be done away with if assimilation was to be possible, quote unquote. Things like that. And you can read why Ainu tattooed their faces. It had a lot to do with betrothal, as well as preventing evil spirits to speak or to enter a woman's mouth. Similarly, Ainu motifs on their clothing was also believed to keep evil spirits and misfortune out of their body. And the Japanese associated this and made it illegal as well. And it was associated with crime and punishment via Japanese tradition, and it itself was regarded as a form of body mutilation, which was, in this case, a voluntary infliction, and was completely averse to the notions of Confucian filial piety and filial conduct. It is also attested in by foreign visitors and travel logs, such as Isabella Bird, that the Ainu were distraught by these bans that were put in place, worrying about the anger of their deities and the incapacity for women to find a husband. As a result of this legal, bureaucratic, cultural assimilation, the Ainu were stripped of their identity as a people, and then the next step by the Hokkaido Development Agency was to make them an active part of the exploitation of the Japanese frontier territory. For this company, for the agency, it was crucial to develop a productive agriculture as fast as possible on the island. Hence, they had to lure settlers from the rest of Japan, and so they enacted several land distribution laws, which were actually inspired by American allotment laws, which similarly disaffected and drove Native Americans from their home territories. And so you can sort of see the influence of American foreign advisors on the Hokkaido Development Agency, such as an individual known as Horace Capron. As for the Ainu, they represented a cheap labor force, an unemployed labor force, which could be taken advantage of already living on the island. Hence, in turn, this hunter-gatherer people was turned into farmers. The development agency had to do away with the previous models of subsistence, which consisted mainly of hunting deer and fish, such as salmon and trout. In traditional Ainu hunting, they used poison arrows, and so those were outlawed. At the same time, the drastic decline of animal populations due to overhunting by Japanese armed with rifles led to the agency to enact other laws to try and regulate these populations, such a law was the Iburi Hidaka region's deer hunting regulation, which restricted hunting hunting periods, the number of rifles in circulation, and the number of authorized hunters. In the same way, Ainu traditional fish nets were also outlawed, and fishing of salmon and trout followed the same fate. Obviously these measures were devastating. The Ainu were weakened and no longer had any mode of subsistence, albeit they became farmers. The situation is such that in 1882, the Hokkaido Development Agency is replaced by the 3 prefectural governments, Sapporo-ken, Noro-ken, and Hakodate-ken. And the first Ainu Protection Acts were passed. But in 1886, they would also be put to an end, so they didn't last very long and didn't have a very big impact. Also, the Ainu would be forced to take on Japanese education in hopes of turning the Ainu into farmers and imperial subjects. They were taught reading, writing, agricultural, and livestock farming. The first experience was a failure, as the Ainu students far away from their homes and families were sent back to Hokkaido in the end. But more schools were made welcoming several Ainu students, and were made in Hokkaido, welcoming several Ainu students along with Japanese students. But this experience is the only one of its kind, and Ainu children will not be accepted into most Japanese schools until 1973. Instead, they were segregated to schools very similar to Native Americans and African Americans in the U.S. Separate but equal, and these schools would be called Aborigine schools, with the first one opening in 1877 in Suikari. By 1879, schools like this would be open up all over Hokkaido. And then by 1891, the Hokkaido Education Association is established to oversee the Ainu children's education, and 10 years later, the former Aborigine Elementary Education Regulation formalizes the separation between Japanese and Ainu students, and the construction of the schools and the subjects are taught. Ainu children are taught reading, writing, and counting, health education, and agriculture. Speaking Ainu is forbidden, as well as teaching history, geography, and science. At the end of the Meiji period, what are the consequences of these assimilation measures? The Ainu can no longer live according to the traditional way, going from hunter-gatherers and traders to farmers and factory workers. They are no longer allowed to practice their religious customs or use their native language. Again, very in stark similarities to the cultural genocide against Native Americans in the U.S., as well as the cultural genocide of other indigenous communities, such as the Sami in Scandinavia and the Aboriginal Australians in Australia. Cultural gap widens between generations. Parents and children no longer speak the same language or practice the same customs. No longer considered Ainu, but still not considered Japanese. The former Aborigines cannot find their place in Japanese society and find themselves completely acculturated. So here is the Japanese face tattooing. Here is the Ainu face tattooing. I apologize. The Ainu face tattooing that women used. Here is an Ainu man. And then here are the various assimilation policies. Here are Ainu who are forced to go to Japanese schools. Here are one of the types of sort of badges and cards that they were forced to wear that would not allow them to speak their own native language. And then here, as you can read here, is several officials who, in 1876, who were forcing these Ainu individuals here to migrate further south. All right, so now we're on to the next to the last section, the Japanese imperial expansion. So the first instance of the expansion of the Japanese Empire would be the successful invasion of Taiwan in 1874 CE. Now, this invasion was done in response to Ryukyu sailors who were shipwrecked off the coast of Taiwan. Remember from the Tokugawa shogunate video, Ryukyu was both a tributary state of China and Tokugawa Japan. And now Imperial Japan. And so these Ryukyu sailors shipwrecked off the coast of Taiwan went ashore, and the indigenous inhabitants of Taiwan who lived alongside Imperial Chinese citizens slaughtered most of the Ryukyu sailors, killed most of the Ryukyu sailors. And so initially the Japanese Empire tried to negotiate with the Qing dynasty, but eventually negotiations collapsed, and so the Japanese Empire invaded Taiwan and pretty handily defeated the indigenous inhabitants of Taiwan, as well as the very undermanned Chinese garrison there. And after doing that, they forced China to officially end the tributary status of Ryukyu with China. And so after that, Ryukyu would be officially annexed into the Empire of Japan. Originally, it was only a tributary state. Now it was actually a part of the empire. And much like the Ainu, the Ryukyns would face assimilation policies, which I'm not going to go into because I've already gone into the assimilation policies that the Ainu did, and the Ryukyns essentially had the exact same thing. So I would just be going back and reading the original statements. But basically, everything that happened to the Ainu happened to the Ryukyns, and it still goes on in various forms to this day. And then after that, a couple of decades later, China would lose a even bigger war to Japan, losing the First Sino-Japanese War, which, if you remember from the war on the video on the self-strengthening movement and the Sino-Japanese War and such, was a sweep for the Japanese military. The Chinese military did not win a single battle. The Japanese military was much more modernized. The Chinese military was modernized as well, but to a lesser degree, and that lesser degree definitely made a difference. And then after that, with the outbreak of the Boxer Rebellion, again, go to the self-strengthening movement video, which will be linked in the iCard, the Japanese Empire would participate in the Eight-Nation Alliance to quell and put down the Boxer Rebellion, with the Eight-Nation Alliance consisting, of course, of the Japanese Empire, the U.S., France, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, and Britain. And the result of the victories, the Japanese victories in the First Sino-Japanese War and the end of the Boxer Rebellion in a victory for the Nine Nations, would eventually lead to rising tensions between Japan and Russia, especially after Russia's occupation of Manchuria in 1900 CE. And this was already sort of building up beforehand because, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video, as well as in the Tokugawa Shogunate video, in the High Qing period video, the Russian Empire had been slowly but steadily expanding into East Asia. And so there was already that tension. I mean, after all, remember, Hokkaido was supposed to be a buffer between the Russian and Japanese empires. Now, Russia controlled Manchuria, or at least part of Manchuria, and so that was an even bigger concern to the Japanese empire than the Russian occupation of Siberia was. So it compounded the issue. This was also compounded by the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway by Russia, which helped Russia's industrialization and helped its military expansion into Siberia. Again, and yet another threat to Japanese interests in Siberia and East Asia. And initially, there would be negotiation attempts between Japan between Japan and Russia, with Germany attempting to mediate it. However, these negotiations would fail because Japan would send several ultimatums saying, no, if you come into this area, we'll attack you. Or at least that's how it was portrayed to Russia by the German embassy. Whether or not it's completely true is up for debate. We do have the Japanese documents, but they do show some degree of hostility in those. So you can be the judge, but either way, this led to the negotiations falling through. These negotiations taking place between 1900 and 1904, and with the failure of these negotiations came the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, which lasted from 1904 to 1905 CE. So this war started at first with the inconclusive battle of Port Arthur, with neither side really gaining any ground from February 8th to the 9th of 1904 CE. But but after that inconclusive battle, the Japanese Navy would blockade Port Arthur from February to August of 1904 CE, with the Japanese Navy and Army gaining several victories, such as the Japanese victory at Yellow River, as well as the decisive Japanese naval victory at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, where the Russian Navy tried to break through the Japanese blockade of Port Arthur. And these victories by the Japanese army against the Russian army would prompt Tsar Nicholas II of Russia to deploy the Baltic Fleet to Japan. Of course, this meant that they had to go a long way, some of them going around Africa, some of them having to go through the Sinai Peninsula and things like that. And during this point in time, the Japanese would gain yet another victory in finally taking Port Arthur after its protracted siege, which lasted from August 1st to January 2nd of 1905 CE. As well as yet another inconclusive battle at yet more inconclusive results at the Battle of Sandepu from January 25th to January 29th of 1905 CE. But the Japanese would shortly after that would win a victory against the Russian army at the Battle of Mukden, and then would also lead to the Japanese army occupying southern Manchuria after this victory. And then eventually this would lead to the final Japanese victory over the Russian army and the Russian Baltic Fleet, utterly destroying it in the Battle of Tsushima in May 27th through May 28th of 1905 CE. So now with that, what happened afterwards? What was the aftermath of this? Essentially, much like the first Sino-Japanese War, was essentially a sweep for Japan. Japan, as you saw, very clearly dominated the Russian Empire during this war. Well, for one thing, the U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt would help negotiate the end of the war with the Treaty of Portsmouth. The treaty gave consent to the Japanese colonization of Korea and later resulted in the annexation of Korea into Japan. The treaty also forced Russia to abandon its expansionist policies into East Asia, but it was also not well received by the Japanese people. The Japanese public were aware of the country's unbroken string of military victories over the Russians, but were less aware of the precarious overextension of military and economic power that the victories had required. News of the terms of the treaty appeared to show Japanese weakness in front of European powers, i.e., signing the treaty, as well as having the treaty negotiated by the U.S., which again is a European power. I'm sorry. News of the terms of the treaty appeared to show Japanese weakness in front of European powers, and this frustration caused several riots, such as the Hibiya riots, and the collapse of Katsurataru's cabinet, who was essentially the prime minister of Japan under the emperor at the time, in January 7th of 1906 CE. And here is the Hibiya incendiary incident, or the Hibiya riots, right here. Following this war, in conjunction with Japan colonizing Korea and eventually annexing it, the island of Sakhalin was divided between Japan and Russia, with Japan taking the southern half and Russia taking the northern half. So now let's take a look at the effects on the Korean populace. So for one thing, it was reported that many Russian females were raped by Japanese troops, causing widespread infections and venereal diseases. Russian troops also looted and burned Chinese villages and raped women, often killing those who resisted or did not understand what they wanted. The justification for this was that the Chinese civilians, being Asian, must have been helping their fellow Asians, the Japanese, to inflict defeat on the Russians, and therefore deserved to be punished. The Russian troops were gripped by the fear of the quote-unquote yellow peril and saw all Asians, not just Japanese, as their enemy. All of the Russian soldiers were much feared by the Chinese population of Manchuria, but it was the Cossacks whom they feared the most on the account of their brutality and insatiable desire to loot. Largely because of the more disciplined behavior of the Japanese, the Han and Manchu population of Manchuria tended to be pro-Japanese. The Japanese were also prone to looting, just like the Russians were, albeit in a considerably less brutal manner than the Russians, and summarily executed any Chinese or Manchus whom they suspected to be spies. The capture of Liaoyang, of the city of Liaoyang, had the misfortune to be sacked 3 times within 3 days, first by the Russians, then by the Chinese police, then by the Japanese. The Japanese also hired Chinese bandits known as chunguses. Chunguses. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that, or chunchuses. Apologies for possibly butchering that. And they hired them to engage in guerrilla warfare and attack Russian supply lines. Only once did they attack Japanese forces, and that attack was apparently motivated by mistaking the Japanese forces for the Russian one. One of these leaders, and one of the most prominent of these leaders of these groups, was Zhang Zhou-lin, who was the future old marshal who would rule Manchuria as a warlord between 1916 and 1928 CE. And he worked as one of these bandit mercenaries for the Japanese. Manchuria was still officially part of the Chinese Empire, and the Chinese civil servants tried their best to be neutral as Russian and Japanese troops marched across Manchuria. In parts of Manchuria occupied by the Japanese, Tokyo appointed civil governors who worked to improve health, sanitation, and the state of roads. But these activities were also self-interested, as improved roads and improved health and sanitation and such lessened the dangers of disease and other dangers for Japanese troops. By contrast, Russians made no effort to improve sanitation or health amongst the Chinese and destroyed everything when they retreated. Many Chinese tended to see the Japanese as a lesser evil. Okay, so now we're going to look at some pretty harmful material. Again, here's a trigger warning. This image that I'm about to show does not reflect my views at all, but it is some of the propaganda that was used by Russia during this war. And here is that, and it's the use of propaganda to justify atrocities against Chinese and Koreans, calling all Asians the Yellow Peril. And here is Zhang Zhou-lin, and here's some of those Hong Huzi, Chongzi bandits. With the ending of the war had, at this point in time, racked up a casualty of around 55 to 56,000 dead and around 144,000 wounded. So now that we've looked at the aftermath of the war itself, like the casualties and the effects on the populace and such, how was the world received? What was the reception of the war received around the world? So first off, Western politicians such as W.E.B. Du Bois, a U.S. senator, and Christian von Effenrels, a Austrian nobleman, saw the Japanese victory as a challenge to Western supremacy, while Eastern politicians such as Sun Yat-sen and Eastern revolutionary groups such as the Committee of Union and Progress saw Japan as a role model for overcoming Western oppression. And here's W.E.B. Du Bois. Here's Christian von Effenrels, Sun Yat-sen, and here is a book about the Committee of Union and Progress. Of course, we can't look at how the war was received, the reception of the war and the rest of the world, without looking at Russia and the effects the war had on Russia. Well, for one thing, Russia, Tsar Nicholas reportedly had continual nightmares of the war, the casualties and the destruction of military institutions and property and things like that. Also, much of the Western world, including Russia itself, began to see the Russian loss in this war as, quote-unquote, the sands running out for the Russian Empire and prestige, as you see here. It also greatly weakened Russia to the point that several rebellions began to break out, and of course, eventually it led to the Bolshevik Rebellion. At the same time that the Russo-Japanese War was coming to a close, there was the attack on, there were several attacks on the capital, St. Petersburg, several smaller rebellion outbreaks, etc., that Russia now had to contend with, in addition to their losses in the Russo-Japanese War. And of course, now after looking at the reception around the world, we now have to look at the effects it had on Japan. And the effects it had on Japan were pretty straightforward, i.e., it was alongside the successful invasion of Japan and the acquisition of Ryukyu and the Ainu during the early stages of the Meiji era. It was now the beginning of the rise of the Japanese Empire. I'm sorry, the Japanese Empire had already begun to rise, but it was like it was the first nail in the coffin of it was the warning bells of the Japanese Empire beginning to expand, because now they had taken hold of a colony in Sakhalin and also a colony in Korea that they would eventually annex into Japan. But the Japanese Empire, after this period, after 1910, is a subject for another series about East Asia during World War II. So with that ends both this video and our series on the origins of modern East Asia. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you wanted to see me cover any of these subjects in greater detail in later videos, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section, and remember to like, share, and subscribe.